Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Saatlander's The Week in Review for Friday, the 14th of June 2024. It's been an action-packed week, beginning, I suppose, with the news of last weekend. The rumors started coming out a few weeks before, but by last Sunday, most of the informed observers in the field of the petrodollar were saying that the petrodollar agreement between the USA and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had not been renewed and that it expired last Sunday, the 9th of June. Now, for those of you who don't know, there have been 10 5-year petrodollar agreements between the USA and Saudi Arabia. And as I say, a few weeks prior, we began to hear rumors that the Saudis had declined to renew the agreement with the USA. Agreement number 11 would not be forthcoming. Needless to say, it was very much underreported because of the potential that the news possesses to have an adverse effect upon the US dollar. The US dollar has been propped up by this 50-year-long agreement because it forced people to pay for petroleum from Saudi Arabia and her buddies in the Middle East in dollars. By now, Friday, 5 days later, it's hysterical. There is hysteria right across the internet. Everybody is talking about this and the potential detrimental effects upon the US dollar. The other big news is that Russia has sent a flotilla of vessels, just 4, with no nuclear weapons or anything like that on them, to Cuba. Now, this has some background. It's not a reenactment of the Cuban Missile Crisis by any stretch of the imagination. That was precipitated by the fact that the USA placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey on the border of the Soviet Union in late 1961, early 1962. The Russians approached through diplomatic channels the USA and said, "Goodness me, please don't do this. You're really pushing your luck now. You make us feel very uncomfortable putting nuclear weapons on our borders." The USA said, "We're not interested in what you have to say." So the Russians sent SS-12 and SS-16 missiles nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba. The USA had a nervous breakdown. They played the story as if this was Soviet aggression, whereas in fact, those missiles in Cuba, about 360 kilometers from Miami, were further away from US soil than the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were away from Soviet soil. The Americans said, "You've got to get rid of these things." The Soviets said, "We are not going to do any such thing. Look what you've done over here in Turkey and Italy, incidentally." And so the Americans backed down. But the American media was complicit in sketching a story, the one that you've heard, which is completely opposite to the truth. When they backed down, the Soviets then said, "Look, if you want us to keep this quiet, your embarrassment, your humiliation, your backing down over the Jupiter missiles, we're going to need a favor or two. Huge economic, trade, and financial concessions worth lots of money at the time." And the Soviets got exactly what they wanted because they had absolutely the moral high ground. This event now in Cuba with the small flotilla of 4 vessels is nothing like that. There are no nuclear weapons involved. However, it is the product of provocation. What were the provocations? There were 2 salient provocations over recent weeks. The first was attacks by drones on 2 Voronezh M intercontinental nuclear ballistic missile early warning system radars. The Voronezh M radars which are used by Russia to see if there are incoming ballistic missiles. Very important. They're huge installations. They can see for 6,000 kilometers. And there are only 8 of them, but they cover all of the borders of Russia and 6,000 kilometers onward. They have huge arcs of penetration which overlap one another all the way around Russia. Now we know that one of the drones flew 1,800 kilometers, so it can't be a Ju-22 or Ju-26 Ukrainian drone. It certainly can't be one of the dinky toys that we've seen them using to drop grenades and what have you. Leave aside that. We're talking about military drones. It can't be a Ju-22 or 26. It can't even be a Turkish Bayraktar drone. It has to be a top-of-the-line European or American drone that did it. So the Russian attitude is, we know that you're providing all of the targeting to Ukraine. We know you provided that drone, and you must have provided the operator in order to do that. You attempted to blind our nuclear defenses. That is adequate pretext for nuclear war. And all of the major observers and commentators agree with that Russian position. And lo and behold, as if they hadn't done enough harm, the NATO member states authorized Ukraine to use their weapons that they donate to Ukraine for the war effort against Russian soil. So, in retaliation for those 2 salient events, the Russians have sent this small flotilla of ships, which is armed with, the flotilla is armed, I think 3 of the vessels are armed with cruise missiles with ranges of up to 4,500 kilometers, some say more, meaning that they can strike the entire eastern seaboard of the United States of America. The plot thickens. Bors-Zickman, some of you may be familiar with that source, a brilliant source, perhaps the best source concerning the war in Ukraine, claims that there are another 11 vessels on their way to Cuba. He also says that at present there are 20 nuclear-powered and nuclear armament possessing, or nuclear arms possessing, Russian submarines off the coast of the USA at present, just kind of idling. So this is a matter that has been taken very, very seriously by many observers. I follow a certain Russian channel, it's in English, in which in this week one of the 2 presenters said to the other one, in the context of what you and I are discussing now, wasn't it a very cold May? The other guy laughed and he said, I don't follow prophecy, but he clearly knew exactly what the first guy was talking about. It turns out that there's a Russian prophecy from long ago, I know very, very little about it, that says that the Third World War would begin after a very cold May. Now, we're talking about the Northern Hemisphere. May is kind of early summer or late autumn. It should be getting warm. Well, it turns out that this past May has been the coldest May for over 80 years, and by quite a long way too. I don't know what is a long way, whether it's half a degree, a quarter of a degree, 3/4 of a degree. But for more than 80 years, May in Russia has never been so cold, and apparently by quite a long way, whatever that may mean. But that's just an aside that I thought I would mention to you, because those 2 guys were talking about that in the context of these nuclear missile submarines off the coast of the USA, the provocations, etc., etc., etc. I'll tell you one more anecdote that you may appreciate. Every second Sunday, I do an interview, a globally broadcast interview on World Broadcasting Network. It's a very, very big interview. And 2 years ago in September, the Belgorod, famous Russian submarine, giant submarine, slipped its moorings and then promptly disappeared. And there was some hysteria in NATO. I read articles at the time in which NATO sources were saying we are very, very, very worried by this. At the time, the Belgorod was the only submarine that could carry Poseidon torpedoes. For those of you who haven't heard about them, the Poseidon torpedoes are a nuclear-driven, nuclear war-headed torpedo. Now, to give you some sense of perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima by the USA had a yield of 16,000 tons of TNT, a 16 kiloton yield, which is measured in TNT terms. Trinitrotoluene, dynamite, that's how they measure nuclear yield. What is its equivalent in dynamite terms? So 16,000 tons of dynamite, like from an old Western movie, would have produced the effect of the Hiroshima bomb. The Belgorod submarine carries 6 at a time of these Poseidon torpedoes, each 18 meters long and 2 meters in diameter. Now, I'm going to generalize. For those of you who are submarine experts, don't get too upset with me. I'm trying to keep this simple for people. The average dimensions of a torpedo are 50 centimeters in diameter. They vary, but there are not many variations. And certainly none of even a meter. Not commonly anyway. And each of these Poseidon torpedoes can move at 160 kilometers an hour. They can go for 10,000 kilometers. They have enough nuclear fuel in their nuclear reactor. And their warheads are 2 megatons, meaning that the yield of the nuclear warhead inside the Poseidon torpedo is the equivalent of 2 million tons, as opposed to 16,000. 2 million tons of TNT. 125 times the capacity or the yield, the potency of the Hiroshima bomb. That's 12,500% greater. I told this story on this World Broadcasting Network interview about 4 weeks later. About 3 months after that, the producer of the interview got hold of me and he said, after the interview, the next one, please don't disconnect. I need to talk to you urgently. Fine. I did the next interview and I waited on the line, on the Discord line, and he disconnected me from the studio and he and I had a private conversation. He told me the most curious story. He said that a friend of his had invited him to an event for military people. He said, it's not the kind of thing I do, but my mate didn't want to go alone, and his wife didn't want to go. She's not interested in such things. So he said to me, oh, would you mind? So I've got somebody to talk to. Maybe the people are unfriendly. And he said, yeah, I'll spend Saturday afternoon accompanying you. They went to this event, and he, that is to say the producer, got to meet these various characters. And at some point in time, he was in a conversation with a Commodore, I think is the correct title for the rank, the correct rank, a senior Royal Navy chap. And the producer said to him, you know, I do a radio show, and every second Sunday there's this South African guy that comes on, and he tells his stories, and he's been telling us one that's just unbelievable. It's about the nuclear torpedoes lying on the bottom of the ocean somewhere, because according to him, this Belgorod, have you heard this guy said to me, I know Belgorod. This Belgorod submarine, it disappeared. Nobody knew where it went to. A few weeks later, it came back. Spy satellites took photographs of it, and it was sitting much higher in the water at the quayside than previously, meaning that it had jettisoned its nuclear torpedoes somewhere for them to be used later on. By the way, these things can hibernate or be dormant, so they can drop them, put them on the sea floor, and then reactivate them like a remote-controlled car when you need to use them. They blow up, creating enormous tidal waves, tsunamis, and I forget the height of the wave. There's a Russian television show which they did the calculations, but it's higher, I checked my facts on this, higher than the highest peak in central Britain. Very high. I don't know, 100 meters, 200, whatever. Kilometer, 400 meters. Very, very high. Apparently, if you release 2 megatons on a continental shelf, where the energy smacks into the shelf, creating a wave. The Commodore said to him, yes, it's all true. Every vessel that the Royal Navy can spare has been searching for those 6 torpedoes day and night since the Belgorod disappeared, meaning that the Royal Navy believes that those torpedoes were deposited on the ocean floor off the west coast of England. Now we're going quite off the topic of this week's news, but you can see the implications of some of these otherwise fairly simple or short news stories. I'm going to cut it short there. We don't yet have a government of national unity, and that is probably suggestive that there is some reluctance, that it is going to be a reluctant and consequentially an ugly marriage. And we'll probably hear about it this weekend, and I'll give you some commentary next week. Thank you very much for watching Suidlander's The Week in Review, in which we cover the major news stories of the week. May God bless you and keep you for the times that lie ahead of us. Bye-bye.